Okay, Erev Tov, Rosh Chodesh Tov, Bruchim Habayim Lekulam. Thank you very much to everybody for coming. My name is Yerachmiel. I used to live in Efrat for a short time, and then in the Gush for many more years. But we've since moved quite far away, actually, so it's nice to be back here. I'd just like to start off, first of all, by thanking everyone who made this evening possible. To Estelle, sorry, I don't remember the last name. Schomburg for helping put all this together, and also for our sponsors for this evening, this evening's shiur, Rachel Kessler, and also Mrs. Weinrab as well, who is sponsoring the shiur in memory of her late father, Robert Koffler, Le'ilui Nishmat Yitzchak Ben Elazar Dov, whose yortzeit is on Purim. So it was a fitting opportunity. His neshama shel an aliyah. So I wasn't planning actually to say any words now standing up, but I thought it was proper to do so since I helped set up this event. I'm a talmid of Rabbi David Bar-Hayim, and especially over the last years, the last few years in particular, I think a lot of people have sort of been seeking sort of a lot of meaning in everything that's going on. And there's very few Rabbonim, I'd like to think almost none at all. But thankfully we have one of them with us tonight who is quite well aware of current events and everything that's been taking place, which goes along with his more general approach, which is somebody who, to my mind, is very grounded in the mitziut and the realities of this world. And so I hope, so for those people who don't know, perhaps have never met Rav Bar-Hayim or who have never even heard of him, we have a YouTube channel. It's I think we probably are the biggest YouTube channel for a Rav from Eretz Yisrael with English videos. There's new videos posted basically every single week. You can find things there if you just want a quick 2-3 minute dose of Torah, or you want to sit down and listen to a 1 hour Gemara shiur or anything else in between. You can find it on our YouTube channel, Machon Shilo. You can search it in English. There's also a Hebrew YouTube channel, Machon Shilo, but written in Hebrew. So I'd encourage everybody to please visit us on YouTube and also to join our Facebook group. We also have WhatsApp discussion groups. So in saying all of that, I will step down. I'd like to welcome and say Toda Rabba to Mori Rabbi Rav David Bar-Hayim for coming and agreeing to speak with us tonight here. And I'm sure that we're all going to get a lot of new perspectives going into Purim from listening to what the Rav has to say. So Toda Rabba to all of you, and Toda Rav Bar-Hayim.
Shalom uvracha. Good evening to everybody. Initially, we discussed speaking about whether to drink or not to drink. That is the question on Purim. So we'll begin with that. And there's quite a few sources that we need to get through. There are source sheets. Does everyone have a source sheet? Okay. There are more here if necessary. We'll go through the sources. And I may add a few more sources that I have prepared. Everybody has heard of the statement of the Gemara. It's the first source on your sheets. In the Talmud Bavli, Masechet Megillah Daf Zayin, Amar Rava, Mihayav Enash Li Basome Bepuraya. That is how it should be pronounced anyway. Avdelo Yada Ben Arur Haman Levaruch Mordechai. Literally, what does that mean? A person is required to drink some alcoholic beverage. We'll discuss exactly what the word Li Basome means, but is often understood to mean to get drunk on Purim. Ad lo yada, to the extent, to the point that one does not know the difference between if he said Arur Haman is said to him or Baruch Mordechai. That's one interpretation. Another interpretation, in fact more likely interpretation, is what the Tosafot and the Rosh quote based on the Yerushalmi. that the custom was, as we also are familiar with this custom today, to, after the reading of the Megillah, to sing some kind of a piyut or something where we say, Arura Zeresh, Baruch Mordechai, Baruch Esther, etc., etc. So the idea, lichora, apparently, is that a person has to drink to the point where he cannot tell the difference between these various statements, which implies a high degree of inebriation, of being basically smashed, in more colloquial terms. So it is usually understood. Immediately, the Talmud goes on to tell us the following story. Rabba wa Rabbi Zera, two Chachamim, avadu seudat Purim b'hadeh hadadeh. They had their Seudat Purim together. Ibesum. And again, depending on how you understand it, and Rashi explains it, or is mefaresh with two words. Ibesum, Rashi says, Ibasome, Rashi says, lehishtaker beyain, and Ibesum therefore means they got drunk. Kam Rabba, during the meal when he was drunk, apparently, shahter Rabbi Zera, he literally slit the throat. That's what it seems to mean. And he killed Rabbi Zera, or injured him at least. The next day, he prayed for him and caused him to be revived, or to come back to life. Depends on how you understand it. L'shana, the next year, Amar le, Rabbah said to Rabbi Zera, let us again do our Seudat Purim together. Amar le, no thank you very much. Last year was enough. Lo bechol sha'ata wa sha'ata, not always can one assume mitrahesh nisa, that a miracle will occur. So I've just explained this statement, or these statements in the Talmud, as they are usually understood. The next source in front of us is an halachic source, which also indicates that this source, the Rif, Rabbeinu Yitzchak Alfasi, understood this to be an halachic statement, because the Rif only brings halachic statements. The Rif simply quotes exactly what the Talmud states. So whatever you understand the Talmud to mean, you can understand the Rif to mean. He just says, Amar Rabba mihayav inash le Basome b'puraya, etc. That's all he says. But immediately, if you look on the same daf in the Rif, and this is what you have before you in source number 3, Rabbeinu Zerachia Halevi, known as Baal HaMaor, in his annotations on the Rif, he writes as follows in the name of Rabbeinu Ephraim. Rabbeinu Ephraim was a Talmid Haver, both a student and a colleague of Rabbeinu Harif. And Harav Ephraim wrote as follows: Miyahu uvda dekam Rabba shahatel Rabbi Zera. From this story that we see in the Talmud, that one of these people injured or even maybe killed the other, idhela memorad Rabba. Therefore, we learn from this, and this is why the Talmud brought this ma'aseh, this story, to tell us that this is not halakha, that you should not get drunk, because you see it can be very dangerous. It can lead to terrible outcomes. And therefore this is not the halakha. And therefore it is not correct to do so. So both Rabbeinu Ephraim and the Baal HaMaor are telling you that there is not one statement in the Talmud, there are two statements. First, it tells you have to get drunk, apparently, you think that's what it means. And then it tells you someone actually did this, and the outcome was terrible. And therefore, the Talmud brought this deliberately to tell you, do not do this. You must not get drunk. It is the wrong thing to do. What else do we find in the Rishonim? Source number 4. This is the Ran in his Perush on the Rif. He basically quotes exactly the same statement that we find in the Talmud, and then he also quotes Rabbeinu Ephraim, as quoted by Baal HaMaor. And the fact that the Ran brings this interpretation, this statement of Rabbeinu Ephraim, and does not comment on it, this therefore implies that he agrees with this understanding, that this is not the halakha. So at this point we can already sum up briefly what we've seen thus far, that according to 3 Rishonim at least, Rabbeinu Ephraim, Baal HaMaor, Rabbeinu Zrachia Baal HaMaor, and Rabbeinu Nisim, the Ran, getting drunk is not the halakha at all. In fact, the Talmud instructed us not to do so. Now, sometimes when I explain my position with regards to getting drunk, or rather not getting drunk on Purim, some people quote to me what the Rambam writes, and that's what we're going to read right now in source number 5. Because the Rambam writes in Ilchot Megillah very simply as follows. He says, Kesad Hovat Se'udah Zo, how is one to perform this miswa of Se'udat Purim? She'ochal Basar, a person has to have a rich and very special meal with good meat and similar foods. Kafi Suda Na'a, a nice special meal, Kafi Asher Timsa Yado, according to his means. V'shoteh yain, and he should also drink wine. Ad she'yishtaker v'yeravem b'shichrut, until, because of the combined effects of the meal, a rich meal with a bit of wine tends to put us all to sleep, correct? We all know this. Go to many homes on a Shabbat midday after the cholent and a bit of wine, a bit of schnapps, and people are nodding off. Okay, that's normal. According to the Rambam, this is what you do on Purim. So some people say, look, the Rambam says, ad she'yishtaker, which lichora means until you get drunk. You drink until you get drunk and nod off. So the Rambam maybe is saying that you should get drunk, or at least somewhat drunk. By the way, before I continue, I will point out that you see from here, from what Rambam writes, that even if there is a miswa to drink alcohol and even to get somewhat inebriated on Purim, that applies during the meal. It's part of the meal. It's part of the Sudat Purim. It's not something that you do all day from the beginning of, right after reading the Megillah at night until the next morning, and then usually what happens then is people sleep until early afternoon and then they start running around looking for a place where they can hear the Megillah read. We all know how this works. That's not what the Rambam is discussing. The Rambam says you drink wine with your meal. It's part of the meal. It's not a mitzvah to be smashed the whole of Purim. There's no such thing. But in fact, Rambam doesn't think so at all. And how do I know this? Because the Rambam discusses in at least 2 other places how negative and how improper an idea and behavior it is to get drunk. Rambam writes this is the next thing quoted, also number 5, it's still the Rambam, from Hilchot De'ot, Perek Hamishi. Rambam writes as follows, Keshe Hacham Shoteh Yain, when a wise, learned man, as opposed to a bur, an Am Haaretz, drinks wine, he drinks wine as part of his meal because it's good for the digestion, etc. That's a normal thing to do, that's fine. However, Rambam says, but a person who gets drunk, such a person is a sinner, and it is to be frowned upon and he is to be chastised for this, and it also causes him, if he is a wise person and Tamid Chachamim, this causes him to lose his chokhmah, to be less wise. Getting drunk is not something that serious people do, says Rambam. And if a Tamid Chachamim gets himself drunk in front of Amei Aretz, simple people who don't understand much about the Torah, not only is he doing something wrong, he's also causing a Hilul Hashem. Why? Because people will see this is what a Tamid Chachamim does. This is a great Rav, and here he is, stoned and acting in a reprehensible manner. Perhaps who knows what he's doing as a result of being totally drunk. And people, instead of reaching the conclusion that studying Torah is supposed to elevate a person and improve a person and train him how to behave and run his life, instead, the Torah apparently doesn't have this effect. Because look, this is a Tamid Chachamim, and look how he behaves. Look, he's just like anybody else. So therefore the Torah is no big deal. It's nothing special. It's not something to get excited about. And that's a Hilul Hashem. That's a terrible Hilul Hashem, says Rambam. And Rambam continues, one should never drink in the middle of the day wine, unless it's part of the meal. Again, and then one drinks a small amount. When one drinks a reasonable amount of wine or something similar together with a meal, it does not cause one to become drunk. What one has to be careful about is drinking not within the framework of a meal. That's one statement Rambam makes in Ilchot De'oth with regards to how wrong and misguided and literally sinful it is to be drunk. And Rambam doesn't make any exception with regards to Purim or anything of the sort. And in case you think he does, we have another source in the Rambam. And that is on the following source in front of you, L'chos Shvitat Yom Tov. Here Rambam is talking about a day which is even more holy and more special than Purim, which is Yom Tov, when there is a miswa min ha-Torah, lismoach, to be happy, to rejoice and to celebrate. Here Rambam writes as follows. When a person spends his regel, his chag, and eats and drinks wine, etc., as part of the miswa of being sameach baregel, lo yimashech beyain, he should not drink too much wine, uveshok, and frivolity, uvekalut rosh, v'yomar shekol sheyosif bazeh yarbe b'miswa. And a person shouldn't think that the more drunk and more frivolous and inane one becomes, the more one is performing the miswa of being happy and celebrating Yom Tov properly. No, Rambam says no. Shashichrut wasahok harbe v'kalut harosh, these things, getting drunk and acting in an improper manner, speaking in an improper manner, ena simha ela holaluth v'sichluth. This is not rejoicing. This is not the miswa that the Torah had in mind. This is simply behaving improperly in a foolish and reprehensible manner. And we are not commanded anywhere in the Torah to act in such a manner, to become wild and unruly and drunk and act in improper ways. The miswa is to worship Hashem through simha, by celebration on Yom Tov and other days of that sort, like Purim also. And this is part of Avodat Hashem. Shne'emar, as it says, Tahat asher lo avadet Adonai Elohecha b'simcha u'v'tuv levav. It says mufurash in the Torah, in Sefer Devarim, that we are supposed to serve Hashem mitoch simcha, through rejoicing, being happy, walking around being depressed and melancholy the whole time is not a miswa at all, and does not lead to Avodat Hashem. Quite the opposite. Ha'lamadta, says Rambam, she'avodah b'simcha, true Avodat Hashem involves simcha. But Efrat la'avodat Hashem, you cannot serve Hashem lo mitoch sahok, lo mitoch kalut rosh, not by acting improperly and in a frivolous manner, lo mitoch shichrut, and not by being drunk. That is not Avodat Hashem. So Rambam tells us explicitly. And again, he doesn't make an exception for Purim, and why would he? If it's not a miswa to do so on Yom Tov, which is a miswa min ha-Torah, why would it be a miswa all of a sudden on Purim? So, to those who have said to me in the past, Rambam says that you should get drunk, my response is, you apparently read only one source in the Rambam, but there's another couple of sources that you need to look at and read carefully, and then you will understand that the word shichruth, shikor in Hebrew, can mean a person has partaken of some alcoholic beverage, and therefore it sort of mellows him slightly. But that's not being shikor kelot, as the expression is in Chazal, not being shikor like Lot was, who didn't know what was going on at all. By the way, I saw in the Sonsino English translation of the Talmud Bavli, I put this at the bottom of page 2, I think the translation is actually very good. It says, Rabbah said, it is the duty of a man to mellow himself with wine. Not to get drunk, to mellow himself with wine. And we're about to explain this further in a moment on Purim. Okay. Thus far, we've looked at some of the more commonly known and commonly quoted sources. But the truth is, I think this entire statement in Masechet Megillah Daf Zayin about drinking on Purim is generally misunderstood, completely misunderstood. And I base what I'm saying first and foremost on the actual word used. The word used in Aramaic is le'i basome. Now, what is the meaning of this word, le'i basome? Rashi in Masechet Megillah writes, and this is true, Rashi says lehishtaker biyain. But I just said a moment ago, lehishtaker, yesh lishtaker, veyesh lishtaker. One can be shikor, but not really drunk at all, and one can really be shikor. But in Aramaic there are two different words, and in fact also in Hebrew there are two different words. In Hebrew there's the expression, which you can hear in modern Hebrew as well. Please, people who speak a nice Hebrew, they use the word liot mevusam. Correct? What does that mean, liot mevusam? It doesn't mean to be drunk out of your mind. It means to be in a relaxed and positive state of mind, perhaps with the aid of a little bit of wine or something like that. But it doesn't mean to be drunk. I'll give you another example. I didn't put all the sources that I could possibly quote here on this page. I wanted to keep it to 2 pages. But I'll quote another source in Masechet Soferim, speaking about Birkat HaLevana, Kiddush HaChodesh or Birkat HaChodesh, that most people usually do on Motzei Shabbat, based on the Masechet Soferim, because there it says that a person should say the Birkat HaYareach. This is not the only opinion, but this is the opinion that it's mentioned there in Masechet Soferim. One should say this bracha on the moon at the beginning of the month, on Motzei Shabbat, Keshehu Mevusam. Now what does that mean, Keshehu Mevusam? It refers, there is some discussion about this, but I'm giving you the bottom line. It refers to the person, not to the moon. The moon is not mevusam. No, there isn't a perush. Someone's smiling here, I see, which is fine. But it refers to the person. Why is a person mevusam on Motzei Shabbat? Very simple. He just had shalosh seudot, which he doesn't have every day of the week, and he probably had some wine with his meal, which is entirely normal. Rambam writes at the end of Yichos Shabbat, shekovim hasuda al hayayin b'Shabbat. The person usually drinks wine with his meal on Shabbat. So he's mevusam. He's an uplifted state of mind. He's in a good mood. That's what it means. And that's the proper time to say this bracha, because it's such a special bracha on the moon, which is also widely misunderstood, but that's a different shiur. So, the word Basome, my claim is basically, and I understood this already many, many years ago, perhaps decades ago, that it does not mean, in Aramaic that word does not mean to get drunk, as we usually understand the term to be drunk. It means to be mellowed, as this translation here, which I think is very precise, as this translation gives it. And then later, years later, I came across, and there are many examples of this, but first I'm going to quote someone who preceded me by a few hundred years, the Korban Netanel, in his Perush on the Rosh. He writes here in Masechet Megillah on this very discussion, and this is number 6 on the source sheet before you, and he himself makes this point. Mihayav libasome piresh Rashi hishtaker beyain. Ulule perush Rashi haithi omer midolok ka'amar mihayev lemirwaye, or I would say in Aramaic liruwaye, that targum shel vayishkar b'toch alo hu rawe, kamo shavkel liruwaye. I'll explain in a moment. אבל הכוונה שמחויב להיטיב לב על ידי שתיית יין הרבה, עד דלא ידע. Basically, what the Korban Netanel has just explained is that the word to be really drunk in Aramaic, the verb, the shoresh, is not bet samech mem, basam, or basome. The shoresh, the word in Aramaic, is liruvuye, resh, waw, yod. Like the word kosi revaya, right, which means it's overflowing. In other words, a person drank too much. He says he's overflowing with wine, with alcohol, so he's gone too far. That's the shoresh that we find everywhere. Where do we find this? Very simple. If you look at this, and the Korban Netanel just quoted us one of the sources for us, when it says that Noah, after the Mabul, got drunk, correct? It says that he got drunk, and it says vayishkar b'tocho halo, vayitgal b'tocho halo. He got drunk and he became uncovered. The Targum Onkelos says the word vayishkar is translated as rawi. He was drunk. It doesn't use the term basam, livsume, or anything like that, because the shoresh bet samech mem in Aramaic actually means something which is tov, naim, matok, something which is pleasant. There's also a word in Arabic which some of us, I'm sure, have heard. It's a name in Arabic, basam. You heard an Arab called basam. What does that mean? That's the Arabic version of the name Noam. Noam in Arabic is basam. Basam means pleasant. This term is used in different places. For example, if you look in source number 8 before you, which happens to be, interestingly enough, on the very same Amud in Masechet Megillah, it's also quoted in Eruvin, but on the very same daf, it says, Rawaha levasima shechiach. What does that mean? He's talking there about a person having eaten a great deal, so they're totally sated and they can't eat any lot more. But we all know that even though you've eaten a lot at a good meal, if there's a good-looking dessert, you'll find some room for it, correct? That's exactly what the Talmud says. The Gemara says, Rawaha, there's always room, lebasima, for that which is sweet, that which is pleasant at the end of the meal, shechiach, there's always room for that. In other words, the word basima refers to something which is sweet, pleasant, that people are interested in tasting, even though they're quite full. That's what the word basim means. You also have the expression, another source that's not mentioned here in the source sheet, in Masechet Sukkah, it talks about levasome kala, which means lahan'im et hakol, is talking about in the Mikdash and celebrating Simchat Bet HaShoeva, etc., and talks about singing and music in the Mikdash. It talks about levasome kala, which means to make the sound, the music, the sound of it pleasant. Whereas when the Talmud Bavli discusses explicitly getting truly drunk, it does not use that shoresh, that verb at all. It uses a different word. That's what you find, for instance, in source number 7. In source number 7, which is from Barachot Daf Kaf Tef, Amar le Eliyahu Navi said to Rav Yehuda, Ahua darav sila hasida. What was his advice to him? La tirtah wa la teheteh, which means do not allow yourself to get angry, and then you will not sin. In other words, anger leads to sin, sinful practices, talk, behavior. If you don't get angry, you won't sin. So never get angry. The other thing he said to him was, excuse me, La tirwe wa la tehete. Do not get drunk, and you will not sin. Again, good advice. Getting drunk can lead to all sorts of unwanted consequences. So therefore, la tirwe, do not get drunk. So what is the term used here by Eliyahu to Rav Yehuda? Ahua darav sila hasida. He didn't say la livsum. He said la tirwe, do not get drunk, because that's the word for being really drunk in Aramaic. It's a different word. And here also Rashi explains, la tirtah v'lo tehete lo tichos shemitoch hakas atava lidei het. If you get drunk, you may sin. La tirwe, Rashi says, lo tishtaker beyayin. This is the same Rashi who in Megillah, Daf Zayin, said to us about the word la ibasome, or the word ibasum. Rashi said it also means lishtaker beyayin. So we could ask Rashi, with great respect, of course, we could ask Rashi, so decide, does the word ibasome mean lishtaker, or does the word lirvuye mean lishtaker? Well, the answer is yes. Both of these are correct. You can be slightly mellowed by a reasonable amount of alcohol. That's, in loose terms, you can also call that in Hebrew lishtaker, but it's not really, you're not really shikor. But in more precise terms, in Aramaic, that's, if you're really drunk, that's your raweh, you're completely drunk, and if you're just slightly somehow influenced by the alcohol to a limited extent, that's called libasume. Another example of this term, this shoresh in Aramaic, libasume or basim, is you find in source number 9 before you, where it says Lewi ikla. Lewi was from Eretz Yisrael, and he went to Bavel, And he got there on a certain day. I won't go into the background of the story, but he got to Bavel, and he says, Amar Basim Tavshila de Bavla'eh. The dishes, the cooked dishes of these Jews here in Bavel is Basim. What does Basim mean? It means very tasty. Matok, ta'im. They're very, very, very tasty dishes they produce here in Bavel. So you see again, this term Basim means, or li Basome, it means to partake of alcohol to a limited extent, to the point where it might cause you to see things a little bit differently and be a bit more relaxed and laid back, but not to be really drunk. There is another source which I'll mention, which is, I think, very relevant to our discussion here, because I know what some people are about to ask me. All right, well, this is all very nice, but it says here that you're supposed to li Basome till the point that you don't know between this and that. How can you not be really drunk and not know the difference between Baruch Mordechai and Arur Haman? Well, I think the answer is to be found actually in Masechet Sanhedrin Daf Ain, where, which is interestingly enough, the gematria of Ain is also Sod. It says there, Rabbah says over there, that Rehane, Hamra wa Rehane Pakhin. Another source I didn't bring here for lack of space. What does that mean? It means sweet smelling substances, Rehane, and Hamra, Yain, in Aramaic, Pakhin, cause me to be more wise, to increase my understanding. What does that mean? Certain substances, such as, and it doesn't have to be something you ingest, it can be something you smell. Because they're pleasant, they can cause a person to see things they didn't understand before. It improves their perception, increases their understanding. And the same is true of wine, says Rabbah. You don't take it my word for it. Rabbah says so. Rabbah says that drinking some wine increased my understanding when it comes to certain things. Some people will also tell you this, that on Purim, when they drink a bit, they see things, they understand certain things they didn't understand before. They experience things a bit differently, which is part of the purpose of wine. It says, Mefurash in the Pasuk, right? Yain yisamach levav enosh. Because yain, alcohol, does cause a certain amount of simha, if done correctly, not done in a wild and non-Jewish way, and a goyish way. That's not how we do things. We all know the expression in Yiddish. Oy 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 shikar is a goy, right? That's not Jewish behavior. But a small amount of alcohol, a shot of whiskey or something, or a bit of wine, each to his own, can add some understanding, because it sort of mellows a person, as the translation that we saw says, and it can increase a person's understanding. Some people will also say the same about other things. Some say that when they smoke a pipe or something, it also causes them to think more deeply, more profoundly. It could be, I don't know, I've never smoked a pipe, but some people make such claims. I'm not mentioning even smoking certain other substances that some people claim expands their understanding and their perception and consciousness. Again, I'm not experienced in these things, but I know some people who make such claims. So certain substances can affect a person in a positive way. Rava tells us this. And this, I think, is what's being said here in Masechet Megillah. Because I don't think that it means that a person should be, based on everything we've seen, I don't think it could possibly mean that you should be totally sloshed to the point that you cannot understand what's being said to you. And as Rambam tells us, that's something which is sinful and wrong, and it also can lead to terrible consequences, as we saw in the story here in Masechet Megillah. So what does it mean? I think it means to say, the whole story of Purim, after all, is what is it all about? What do we see in the Megillah of Purim, of Esther? That often we witness, we see different things going on in the world, and we can't possibly understand why is Hashem doing this, and the situation seems very dire, very serious, fraught with danger, And sometimes we don't understand at all, and we never understand. And other times we see, but only later, when things have played themselves out in a certain way, we begin to see that maybe this is Hashem's plan all along, that this should happen, and then that should lead to A, it should lead to B, and that leads to C. And in the most miraculous way, the outcome is something very different from what we could have expected at the beginning. And this is what we see in Megillat Esther. We all know that the name of Hashem does not appear in Megillat Esther. And all the events that are related in Megillat Esther are entirely natural, earthly, normal events. In other words, there's nothing miraculous, there's nothing supernatural. Correct? Ahasuerus was angry at Vashti. He got himself another wife. He got himself a new wife all the time. Anyhow, so there was one more. She happened to be Jewish. He didn't know this. Mordechai told her not to say so. Why did he tell her not to say so? Well, maybe Mordechai knew things or suspected something or was planning something. We don't know, but that's what he said to her. And then this Haman comes along, which was not known at that before, but when all these events initially took place. And Haman happens to be a tremendous anti-Semite, which is another discussion we can have in a moment, why he was such a person. And he wants to kill all the Jews. And who knows if for this particular reason, at this moment in time, you achieved this particular position in the Persian Empire, this tremendous empire. You can have an effect, says Mordechai to Esther. You can have an impact on what's going on here. So I think the statement Ad lo yada refers to understanding, appreciating the reality of the world, not from the more banal day-to-day perspective where we look at things and we say, what's going on here? Why is this happening? Why is Hashem doing this? And what good could come from all of this? Megillat Esther tells us that from the most unusual and sometimes even unseemly goings on in the natural course of events, in history, in the actions of people and how they interact and what this person did and as a result of what that person said, etc., etc., the most unusual things can result. And Hashem is behind all of these machinations, all of these goings on. Ad lo yada ben Arur Haman levaruch Mordechai, I think, is coming to tell us that you should know that you don't always understand what's going on. You think what you see is what you see, and that's what there is. That's what there is to see. There's nothing else going on here. This is just a terrible story. This young Jewish girl is taken off to the harem of Ahasuerus. What a terrible thing. How can we not just sit down and wail about this? Which one certainly could. But we see from the Megillah that some tremendously positive things can also result from the most unusual and even the most negative events. Because Hashem controls the world. Hashem is in charge. We're not in charge. We have to do what we can do, what we must do, what we understand that the Torah instructs us to do. But we cannot determine the outcome. Hashem can determine the outcome. And sometimes He does this in the most miraculous, the most unusual way. And the Megillah teaches us about miracles that are entirely non-miraculous, non-supernatural. In other words, the Talmud, for example, in the Bavli, Masechet Arachin, talks about when we say Hallel and when we don't say Hallel, and it talks about why we don't say Hallel on Purim, and it refers to the Nes of Purim, Mishum Nisa. So you could ask yourself, what sort of Nisa? What was the Nes that took place on Purim? Nothing miraculous, nothing beyond the normal course of nature took place anywhere in Masechet, in Megillat Esther. But the Nes is precisely that Hashem's interaction with the world, Hashem's hashgaha, can direct things in a certain way and to achieve a certain result without us seeing anything miraculous. If you examine each particular step in Megillat Esther, each one of those actions, the fact that Mordechai heard about the plot to kill Ahasuerus, and he informed Esther, and Esther told Ahasuerus, and then Haman, and then this, and then that, each one of those events makes perfect sense by itself. It doesn't seem unusual, doesn't seem remarkable in any way. But if you look at the entire Masechet, the entire Megillah, the Masechet HaDvarim, the whole unraveling and the the events as they flow one from the other and as they impact one another, then you begin to see that such a thing could never possibly happen in the normal course of events. Or as the expression goes, you couldn't make this sort of thing up. Who could make up such a story? That's exactly why some people, of course, will tell you, well, there was never such a thing. It's just a story. It's just a legend. Well, that's the point. Some people, they see something most unusual and very unlikely, and they'll say, well, it couldn't possibly have happened. So it must be just a legend or something like that. We know that the world is a very strange place, and sometimes fact is stranger than fiction, and Hashem can orchestrate all kinds of events within the framework of natural occurrences and direct them towards a certain outcome. And that, I think, is what is intended by this statement, Ad lo yada, that if we need to somehow expand our consciousness and our understanding and maybe mellow ourselves a little bit with a bit of wine or something like that and a good meal to take a broader view of current affairs, of history, of what have you, okay, that's what we might need sometimes, to see things in a more profound and more precise manner and understand how Hashem works behind the scenes. And that, I think, is the essential lesson of Purim. That is the real message of Purim, that Hashem is always working behind the scenes and you don't necessarily see it. And sometimes you will see it later and sometimes you will never know. That is briefly what I wanted to say about the topic of getting drunk, or rather not getting drunk, on Purim. I want to mention briefly something else to do with the Megillah.
Can I ask you, are you taking questions? Or?
I will take questions, but let me just speak about make another point, and then we'll open it up for questions. If we look at the beginning of Sefer Ezra, the very beginning of the second chapter of Sefer Ezra. And we have to mention here the historical context. And this has to do with Megillat Esther as well. When did the events of Megillat Esther take place? How long ago? Does someone know, roughly? Roughly 2,500 years ago, a bit less. According to the usual chronology of these things, there is another way of calculating the dates and the years, but that's again another shiur, and it's not for now. I'll go with the usual chronology, which is also perfectly reasonable, I think. The king mentioned in Megillat Esther, Ahasuerus, who was known in sorry?
His son built the temple, so we can calculate it.
Well, that's also complicated, but we won't go into all of that now. But he was known in the Persian language as Ahasuerus, and by the way, the word Ahasuerus appears once in the Megillah, basically written as Ahasuerus, which is interesting. Which also tends to support the idea this is the king we're talking about. From what we know, he ruled approximately from 485 to 465, give or take, before the Common Era. And for the record, that is also more or less, in almost precisely, the time of Ezra Sofer. Again, according to many sources, shall we say, and an accepted chronology of these events. And we're talking here about 50 or 60 odd years after the beginning of the return of Jews from Bavel and Paras, mainly from Bavel, to Eretz Yisrael, the beginning of Beit Sheni, the Second Temple period. Now in Sefer Ezra, the beginning of Perek Beth, it gives a list of people who came to Eretz Yisrael, העולים משבי הגולה אשר הגלה נבוכדנצר מלך בבל לבבל וישובו לירושלים. These are the Jews who returned to Yerushalayim. אשר באו עם זרובבל, ישוע, נחמיה, סריה, רעליה, Mordechai. It says here Mordechai. Do we know for a fact it's the same Mordechai as in Megillat Esther? We don't know that for a fact. Is it possible? Yes, it is possible. And some of the Mefarshim say so. What is clear, I think, from the Megillah and from various statements of Hazal, and particularly if one reads Sefer Ezra and Sefer Nehemiah and one understands the historical context, what was going on here in Eretz Yisrael roughly 2,500 years ago. Well, you may be surprised, and you may not be surprised, to learn that it's surprisingly similar to what goes on today. In other words, Jews returned to Eretz Yisrael, but in their absence, all sorts of non-Jews decided this is a nice place, and those Jews whom we didn't like anyhow, they're not here, so we'll come and take over this place, right? All kinds of people, Edomim and various Arab tribes, Bedouin, and one such tribe were Amalekim. Amalekim are Bedouin, for those who don't know. They're just another type of desert dweller. And at one point in history, they were quite a powerful force, and they had a king by the name of Agag, right? Agag. And that's why Haman is referred to as Agagi. He was a descendant of these people. Now, if you read carefully, which we're not going to do now, Sefer Ezra, Sefer Nehemiah, and also, by the way, you could also read Sefer Haggai. You can read Sefer Malachi to get a sense of what was going on at that time, at the beginning of the Second Temple period. We see that the Jews were under tremendous pressure from all these other nations that had infiltrated Eretz Yisrael. They had set up business, they had set up their shops and their communities all over the country. They did not like this idea at all, that these Jews decided to return. It wasn't what they had planned at all. And then they heard even worse, that now they're intending to build a mikdash, a temple. And then Nehemiah comes along and says, well, we need to build a wall around Yerushalayim. So what happens, and this is all explicitly written in Sefer Ezra, the people here in Eretz Yisrael, the non-Jews, who didn't like these Jews who had returned, they immediately start sending letters to the Persian Empire, to the court, and telling them, these Jews that have returned, that you've allowed to return, they are intending to build a mikdash, and they are intending to build a wall around Yerushalayim, and they're really intending, what they really want to do, is to revolt against you. And therefore, stop what they're doing. Give the order that all their activities be ceased immediately. And this went on for many years. The Jews were busy sending letters to explain their actions and how they had received explicit permission from an earlier emperor, from Koresh, to return and to build a temple. And they also even received permission to build the wall around Yerushalayim. They were not doing anything that they had not received permission to do from the emperor, because they were not independent. They were living under Persian rule, as it says Mufurash in Sefer Nehemiah. Ki avadim anachnu lemalchei faras. Mordechai was a shtadlan. That's how I read the events. I think Mordechai's activities in the Persian court was as a lobbyist for the Jewish people in the Persian court. And Haman, who became a very important figure in the politics and in the government of Persia, he was from the Agagim, he was from the Amalekim. He belonged to that party of people who were trying to hinder the Jews in every way they could, to cause them to cease and desist from everything they were doing, building the Mikdash and settling the land and expanding their Yeshuvim. Sound familiar? And attacking the Jews physically. Maybe you've heard of that also recently, maybe. After all, it says in Furash and Sefer Nehemiah, when they were trying to rebuild the wall of Yerushalayim, they were attacked. They were under attack. And they had to have armed guards, etc., etc. It's all written there. If it sounds familiar, well, maybe that's because it is. Because it's exactly the same reality. The reality in Eretz Yisrael 2,500 years ago, nearly, was almost entirely analogous to what we have today. The Jews returned, at that time many fewer than we have today. Today we have something like 6 million Jews in Eretz Yisrael, roughly. At that time, initially it was tens of thousands. Over time it began to grow. But the Jews returned. There were lots of other people, non-Jews, who immediately refer to themselves, or the Tanakh refers to them as Sarei Yehuda, the enemies of Yehuda, of the Jewish people, and they did everything they could to oppose them, and sometimes to attack them physically, other times to set in motion all kinds of political machinations and goings-on and all kinds of campaigns. And then Haman comes along, and Haman has a great idea what to do with the Jews, because really this is what his people have always wanted to do, and now he's in a position perhaps to do it. But really we're talking about a clash between the Jewish people and their enemies. Mordechai represents the Jews. He is trying to lobby for the Jewish cause in Eretz Yisrael in the Persian court, and Haman is doing the opposite. And that's the historical background, I believe, to the events of Megillat Esther, which are generally not very well understood. But the more you read the Megillah and the more you read those other books in the Tanakh that I mentioned, the more these things, I think, become fairly clear. Very well. I've said enough, and now I believe we have some questions. Yes?
So I appreciated the point you made about when you don't know the difference between one and the other, we don't know it all, etc. So I appreciate that point. How is that couched in the terminology of when you don't know the difference between arur, one and the other? How does that play out in those words? You know what I'm saying?
I think I understand your question, and as I attempted to explain, there was this formulation that is mentioned explicitly in the Talmud Yerushalmi, that Tosafot mentioned in Megillah Daf Zayin, where, having read the Megillah, people would sing this song, which is also sung today, about Arur Haman and Baruch Mordechai, Baruch Esther, Arura Zeresh. Now, when you say Arur Haman, well, that seems like a straightforward statement, right? Haman, he's Arur, he's to be cursed, he's to be reviled, to be hated. Mordechai, Baruch Mordechai, he's a good guy. There's good guys and there's bad guys. And that's true, but it's also true very often in human affairs that things are not quite so clear-cut and black and white. This person seems to be a bad guy, but really he has his own agenda and he's doing A, B, and C for his own reasons, but Hashem has his way of channeling those things that he wants to do to his own purposes, to Hashem's purpose. So he looks arur to you, but who knows what may come of this, what may come of this event. If you want to mention now what's going on right now in Europe, Russia, Ukraine, don't ask me if I know what's going on there, I don't. Exactly why it's happening, I think I have an idea, but and if someone asks me in a moment, is this Milchemet Gog or Magog, as I've heard some people suggest, I will tell you I have no idea, although I do understand that Milchemet Gog or Magog is supposed to take place here. To which you could also say, well, it might spill over to here, it might come here. Well, who knows, that also could happen, but I don't know that. What I do know is that Putin is doing what he's doing for his own reasons. He has his agenda, he has his aims, he believes in Mother Russia, he believes in the Russian people, he believes that at least Eastern Ukraine belongs to Russia and always has, and he has a point, by the way, and the Ukrainians also have a point, at least some of them do, and if they really are as righteous as they like to claim, well, allow me to express my doubts. But one never knows really what's going on and why Hashem is making this happen and what's going to be the outcome of all this tomorrow, in 2 years from now, in 20 years from now. We don't know. And that's the Ad Lo Yada, that you can see Arur Haman, you can see Baruch Mordechai and think you've got the picture straight and it's absolutely crystal clear, but actually you don't know exactly what's going on. That's the idea.
So I can see where there's a Baruch Haman aspect. What would be the Arur Mordechai?
Not Arur, not that you mix it, not that you have to say Mordechai is Arur, no. Just to understand that reality is more convoluted and more complex than we are able to understand most of the time. And we only sometimes begin to understand things much later. Yes.
I came late, so I apologize.
Okay.
Sorry. But I kind of looked a little bit in your source sheet. A couple of things came to mind. Like, one of them is that, first of all, lev melachim b'yad, so basically, what I meant by that is basically the heart of the people that are leaders is basically in Hashem's hands. So really, it's not that Putin wants this and the other guy wants that. Everything is like a chessboard, is being manipulated by Hashem. So that's one thing I wanted to say.
Agreed.
The other thing is also, you mentioned that, this is good, this is bad. There's no bad coming from Hashem. Everything is good. At the end of times, we will know really why things happen and why, like for us personally or for the world. But all of it is going to Geula. Geula is the master plan. So like everything is like a chessboard. And yes, we're like part of it, but we don't know really what's going on. And about, like I'm a Chabad, so the issue of Simcha is really important. I think we see it a little different with the Rebbe, that he said that you can't literally work unless you're in a Simcha. And that's a Hasidic concept that, one of the gravest mistakes that we do in our avodah is if we don't work in a simcha. That's like one of the biggest offenses. Like, I guess that's what I understand.
But I recall that it's actually written in the Tanakh before Chassidut. Ivdu with Hashem b'simcha. Correct.
We kind of like
Rambam also quoted this, as we read.
Baal Shem Tov really like got it into like the idea that you can work simply, like doing Tehillim. You don't have to be like complex avodah, but by simcha brings you to a better avodah. So a couple of things I saw in the source sheet that I want to mention.
Every individual and every community as a community can and should do whatever it is that they find themselves able and motivated to do. Anything good. For one person it's saying X number of Pirkei Tehillim every day, for example. For another person it might be Maaseh Hesed. Of course, these are not mutually exclusive. You can do both. There's a limited number of hours in the day, but everyone can do lots of things if they want to. That's all very true. And the Jewish nation also has a purpose, has a destiny, as expressed in the Torah in explicit words. V'atem tiyu li mamlechet kohanim v'goy kadosh. That is the destiny, that is the purpose, that is the aim of the entire Torah. Now, to motivate and to organize and to bring things about in such a way that the entire nation all pulls in the same direction and works towards Hashem's will in the world, that's a difficult thing. And right now we're not in that position, as we know, unfortunately. But as individuals and as communities, we can do many, many things. An individual can decide for himself what he's going to do, and he doesn't have to discuss with anybody else if he doesn't want to. If a person wants to work with another person or another two people, it's also relatively simple if they're of the same mind. If it's a whole community, well, immediately they also, sometimes you get a bit of politics and a bit of this and a bit of that, a bit of Lashon Hara, who knows, it's more difficult, but we try and overcome these things as we should. Hopefully we also will achieve a time when all of Am Yisrael understands, or at least a critical mass within Am Yisrael, if not everybody, will understand what is required, what Hashem wants of us, and how do we know what Hashem wants of us? That we discover in the Torah. The Torah is the blueprint, is the roadmap for what we do, when we do it, and what are our goals. That's in a nutshell. Yes?
So, in light of a lot of the sources that you brought, it seems obvious that many Gedolim community rabbis are aware of many of the sources. They know what Rabbi Bar-Hayim says, what the Rambam says, and what many say about the dangers of people getting drunk and leading to sin. How come we don't see really that there's a reining in of the Jewish people to not act this way, and it's become okay, it's become accepted that people get sloshed. It's
a good question.
You would hear more from the rabbis that it should be done in a different way, and it's not. So why is that the case?
First of all, the question is correct and legitimate. You're absolutely right. And we would expect perhaps something different. And we should expect something different, because I believe the sources speak for themselves. By the way, there are other sources I didn't mention. We haven't got time to mention all the sources. But if you look at the Beth Yosef in the Torah on this matter, you will see he brings another couple of opinions who explicitly say it's asur to get drunk, etc. So it's not as if it's hard to find the sources. They're there. But we also know that there's a Yetzer Hara out there. And if people feel that at least once a year they have licensed to get drunk, well, it's hard to to rein them in. It's difficult because they think they'll tell you what the Maharal says in Or Hadash in his Perush on Megillat Esther, that you're absolutely supposed to get totally drunk, which is true. He does say so. I don't accept what the Maharal says, but that's what the Maharal says. I can't deny that. It's right there, black and white. So if someone wants to say, well, there is someone who says I should be getting drunk, you're right, there is someone who says that. There's more than one person, perhaps, or one opinion that says so. I think it's wrong. I think it's misguided. I showed you quite a number of sources, and even the lashon, the language, the words themselves make it quite clear. The word Basome does not mean to get drunk. It means to be mellowed, as the translation, the Sonsino translation very beautifully puts it. As Rabbah says in Masechet Sanhedrin Daf Ayin, that wine and other things of that nature, pakhin, they increased my wisdom, my understanding, my ability to perceive certain things. That's how it should be. But sometimes people take advantage of what they think is a heter to do something that they'd like to do anyhow, but they know they're not supposed to. So once a year, let's go for it. That's what they think to themselves. Well, that's why we're here. That's why I came to tell you tonight. That's wrong. It's simply not right. We all know what the results of this behavior are. We all know about the yeshiva bochers who stagger through the streets, vomiting all over the place. We all know about, I also learned in yeshiva once upon a time. I remember how after the Megillah and after the meal in the yeshiva, people would drink, and they called it dancing, but really it was just sort of a drunken stupor, staggering around in circles till all hours of the morning, to the early morning. Literally, unfortunately, vomit all over the place. As a result, these people didn't get up for davening the next morning. They didn't hear the Megillah the next morning. They had to go running around at 3 p.m. to find someone who could read the Megillah for them. I'm sure that you all know about these things. You've heard these things. You've seen these things. That can't be right, correct? It can't be the right thing to do. But if a person does drink themselves silly till 3 in the morning, that's what's going to happen. And that's not Torah. That's not the mitzvah. That's not the concept at all. Yes.
So David HaMelech says in Tehillim that darkness and light are the same. I think it's Tehillim 139.
Mm-hmm.
So to me, that's the idea, that you can't tell the difference between darkness and light. Darkness and light are the same. And that's a very high level, of course, to be at. But it also, I'm thinking how Purim is perhaps the only Chag that will still be around during the Geula, after Mashiach comes. Purim will still be celebrated?
Yes, that's a very good point that you make, and I thank you for reminding me of that particular point. I wanted to mention that. Chazal say, and Rambam quotes at the end of Hilchot Megillah, that La'atid Lavo, the Nevi'im and the Ketuvim will be batelim, but Megillat Esther will not be batel. In other words, Megillat Esther will still be very important and something that we must read and remember all the time. And I think the reason why Chazal said that is what we discussed before, that it's one thing for a Navi to tell you there will be all these events, some of them even miraculous or unusual or spectacular, and for those things to come to pass, that's an amazing thing. But once it's happened, it's over. But Megillat Esther, as I said before, tells us that the world is an ongoing, constant miracle. machine. All sorts of things that are happening that you don't perceive at that moment as being miraculous or special or outstanding. But in the fullness of time, you will possibly understand why this is so. In other words, Hashem's hashgacha is always working in the background, whether you see it or not. Usually we don't. Sometimes we think we must see it because the events are so outstanding and so unusual, like the events of Megillat Esther. But a lot of the time we don't really see these things. We certainly don't see it at that moment. Maybe we understand retroactively years in the future. So Megillat Esther has a very powerful, profound message that we always have to bear in mind, that Hashem's hashgacha, Hashem's running of the world is a reality. It's something that we usually cannot perceive with our eyes or immediately, but we know it's real. And that's why Megillat Esther is such a powerful educational text, shall we say. And that's why Chazal say there will not be batel la'atid levo. Now, were there any other issues or questions that people wanted to mention?
I just wanted to make a comment that in all of my years, that drunk, sloshy, vomiting behavior, I don't see that among women. That's like a guy thing.
Usually that's true. That's
significant and worth pointing out.
Although I must tell you that
I'm not saying there was never a woman in the history.
you're absolutely right. You're right. I must tell you, my wife told me a couple of years ago she was in a certain place on Purim and she saw women getting drunk as well. But you're right. Generally, you're right. That's true. And that's nothing for men to be proud of. Yeah.
I often hear Megillah readers call Mordechai Mordochai. And I was wondering where that comes from.
That is the more correct version of the name. In the more accurate versions of the Tanakh, the ancient manuscripts, it's Mordechai with the hataf kamatz under the dalet. So it's not Mordechai, it's Mordechai. Not all, but somewhere in between.
It's more precious.
That's more precise. That's how it appears in the Ktav Yad of the Kether, of the Ktav Yad Leningrad, and a few other ancient sources.
Right.
Right.
I have a question.
Yes.
In Ezra, it's written that Mordechai came back with Ezra and Nehemiah. So who?
Any Mordechai, not necessarily the
We
same
don't
one.
know.
All right. So
That's
I'm
what it
saying
said.
if it was,
Mm-hmm.
then who's the one buried next to Queen Esther in the tomb?
Well, that's not a problem at all. Even if we think it's the same Mordechai, which we don't know for a fact, but even if we think it's the same Mordechai mentioned in Ezra, it doesn't mean he was only here. He could have been traveling backwards and forwards, just like Nehemiah. Nehemiah was served the emperor in the Persian court, as is written at the beginning of Sefer Nehemiah. He asked permission to come to Eretz Yisrael for a brief period. He was here for that period, and he returned, as had been agreed with the emperor. He couldn't disobey the orders he received. And then he eventually asked to come again, and he did, the second time. People traveled. There were highways. The Persians were famous for constructing a highway system with all those speedy hashdar panim, all those speedy messengers, taking messages on those special horses. They were a very sophisticated operation. Anything else? Yes.
It's related because it's Purim. I heard that Purim is actually the holiest night of the year. Is there truth to that? Instead of spending Purim night at a party drinking, we should really be using it more wisely.
Purim is a very special day. The Megillah, as we have discussed, is a very special part of the Tanakh, even though Hashem's name doesn't appear there. That's perhaps why it's so special. But I myself do not have a device for measuring kedusha. I don't know how do you do that? How many kilos or how many kilowatts of kedusha? I don't know how to measure that. I think it's an unusual statement because lichora, the holiest day of the year is the holiest day of the year in the Jewish calendar occurs every week. It's called Shabbat, and Shabbat and Yom Kippur halachically are on the same level. So really we have Yom Kippur every week, except that we're allowed to eat and do other things on Shabbat that we don't do on Yom Kippur. But really we have a very special, very holy day, and halavai we should all understand how special and holy a day it is every 7 days. And we have the Hagim, and we have Yom Kippur, we have Rosh Hashanah. Purim is not min HaTorah. on the one hand. On the other hand, and this is again a separate shiur, but Purim is actually a paradigm for instituting a new Chag, a new special day in the Jewish calendar. It wasn't at all a simple matter for this new Chag called Purim to be accepted by the Chachamim, and this is discussed explicitly in the Talmud Bavli, in the Talmud Yerushalmi, in the Midrash. Mordechai and Esther were for it, and they pushed it, and they even used their royal prerogative to twist the arm of certain Chachamim to get it accepted. It wasn't accepted overnight, but it was accepted. So if that also reminds you of certain things nowadays, that's also true. Some Rabbanim are very opposed to new special days during the calendar nowadays, and some are for it. This is not a new phenomenon. The same thing exactly happened 2,500 years ago. Yeah.
I just wanted to say about what you said, that there is a reference to it in what you said actually right now, but I'll tie it in because in Hebrew the word ke is like, and the word Kippur,
Purim
is Kippurim.
All right. Well,
so
that's more of a.
The word,
This is mentioned in the name of the Ari.
Right,
what you just said now.
Of the four is mean like to do a rhyme.
All right. Well.
Okay? And the Kepur means like Purim. So there is an essence to this idea that one, they keep this holiday forever, okay, even in Mashiach, but it's like Purim, but it's like we're twisting, coming out of like the sorrow of like fasting to happiness of sorts. So I think it's like there is some sort of an essence of importance to it, even though it's a new in the future to come.
Okay, I'm looking at the clock, and we have to finish in a moment. So I'm going to end with the following thought. There's a sheet here, 2 pages actually, which those of you who are interested may look at, may take. And seeing that we were discussing various things that go on in the world, things that are going on now, things that went on 2,500 years ago, and it's not always easy to understand why these things happen. But sometimes in the fullness of time, we can appreciate what this brought about, the ramifications of certain events. And I think that the last 2 years have caused many people to think and rethink what goes on in the world, why things happen, who makes decisions, how we should run our lives, what kind of dictates we should accept and should not accept. I don't think the last 2 years were some kind of mistake or aberration. I think it's entirely possible that we should view the events of the last 2 years, I refer of course to COVID and everything that goes with it, as a wake-up call, as an opportunity to think, to rethink, to take stock of various things and to understand who the real leaders of the Jewish people are, who they should be, what's wrong with the current leadership, with the establishment, all kinds of establishments that wish to tell us how to live our lives. I, for one, have felt for these past 2 years that there's something very wrong, something very perturbing has been going on, and I'm not sure that it's entirely a mistake or some kind of coincidence. I think it's perhaps something that we should think about. And this document here, was not written now or not written 2 years ago. I formulated this brief document something like 10 years ago. But now it seems there are more people who are willing to consider some of the ideas and some of the implications of those ideas. So I'm just throwing that down, as it were, as a gauntlet, as a challenge. It's there, you can read it, you can make of it what you will. It has nothing to do with getting drunk, by the way. Okay? Okay, so I wish you all good evening and Purim Sameach, but don't get drunk.
Thank you, Rabbi Bar-Hayim. We would like to encourage our viewers to share these videos with friends and send in your responses. We would also like to suggest the following opportunity to our viewers. If you identify with Rabbi Bar-Hayim's message and would like to sponsor or dedicate a video interview with the rabbi in honor or memory of a loved one, if you would like to obtain Birkon Nusach Eretz Yisrael or invite the rabbi for a speaking engagement, please email us at office@machonshilo.org. If you are inspired by Rabbi Bar-Hayim's message and would like to get involved in Torah Eretz Yisrael activities in your local area, please fill out the relevant form by going to the link which appears on the screen.